The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as crowds gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among the tourists and locals, a figure in civilian clothes stood quietly near the iron gates. His name was Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old former Marine who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before returning home to cope with wounds that ran deeper than the eye could see. Marcus had come to London not as a tourist, but as someone searching for something he couldn't quite name. The therapy sessions back home had helped, but the nightmares still came. His counselor had suggested travel, new experiences, anything to break the cycle of isolation he had fallen into since leaving the service. So here he was, standing among strangers, watching another kind of soldier perform their duty, the Royal Guards, emerged in their iconic red uniforms and tall bearskin hats, moving with precision that Marcus recognized immediately. These weren't just ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. Their movements spoke of real training, real discipline, real pride. As they took their positions, Marcus found himself studying their faces beneath the shadows of their hats. One guard in particular caught his attention. The man was roughly his own age, with the same controlled stillness that Marcus had learned in the Marines. There was something in his posture, a tension that went beyond ceremonial duty. Marcus had seen that look before, in mirrors and in the faces of fellow veterans who carried invisible burdens. The crowd around them buzzed with excitement, phones clicking and flashing as tourists captured their memories. Children pointed and laughed, delighted by the spectacle. But Marcus barely noticed the noise. His focus had narrowed to this one guard, this kindred spirit in red wool and black boots. As the ceremony began, Marcus stepped closer to the barrier. Not close enough to interfere, but close enough to see the man's eyes when they briefly met his own. In that split second of connection, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. The guard's expression didn't change, couldn't change while on duty. But Marcus saw something flicker there. The tourists continued their chatter, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding before them. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking why the soldier wouldn't smile. An elderly man complained about his aching feet. A teenager tried to get the guard's attention with exaggerated waves and funny faces, but Marcus remained still, his own military bearing unconsciously matching that of the guard before him. He understood the weight of the uniform, the responsibility it carried, the way it could both protect and isolate the person wearing it. He knew what it meant to stand at attention while the world moved around you, to be strong when strength was the last thing you felt. The guard's duty required him to remain motionless, eyes forward, expression neutral. But Marcus could see the slight tension in his jaw, the careful control of his breathing. These were signs he recognized from his own struggles with hypervigilance and the constant alertness that military service had burned into his nervous system. Minutes ticked by, and still Marcus didn't move. The crowd around him shifted and changed as people took their photos and moved on to other attractions. New faces appeared, old ones disappeared, but these 2 veterans remained locked in their wordless encounter. Something about this moment felt important to Marcus, though he couldn't have explained why. Maybe it was the recognition of a fellow warrior struggling with the transition to civilian life. Maybe it was the realization that service took many forms, and that this guard's daily duty was as real and meaningful as anything Marcus had done overseas. The guard's name was James Mitchell, and beneath his stoic exterior he was fighting his own battles. The same demons that haunted Marcus visited James in the quiet hours when the crowds went home and the ceremony ended. The same questions about purpose and identity that kept Marcus awake at night echoed in James's mind as he stood his watch. As the morning wore on, an unspoken conversation began to develop between them. Not in words, but in shared understanding. 2 soldiers from different armies, different wars, different worlds, finding connection in the space between duty and humanity. The crowd would soon witness something extraordinary, though they wouldn't immediately understand what they were seeing. The crowd began to notice something unusual happening near the guard post. A man in jeans and a simple jacket had been standing perfectly still for over an hour, his attention focused entirely on one of the royal guards. Unlike the typical tourist behavior of quick photos and hurried movement, this stranger had adopted a military bearing that mirrored the soldier's own posture. Marcus felt the familiar burn in his muscles that came with maintaining position. His back straight, shoulders squared, feet positioned just so. It was muscle memory from countless hours of drill and ceremony, from standing at attention in formation under the scorching desert sun. But this wasn't about showing off or proving anything. This was about respect, about recognizing a fellow warrior and honoring what he represented. James, the Royal Guard, had noticed the American almost immediately. It was part of his training to be aware of everyone in his vicinity, to spot potential threats or disturbances. But this man posed no threat. If anything, his presence was oddly comforting. James had been having a particularly difficult week, struggling with anxiety that made these public duties feel overwhelming rather than honorable. The nightmares had been getting worse lately. Scenes from his deployment to Iraq would flash through his mind during the ceremony, causing him to grip his rifle tighter than necessary. The crowds felt more oppressive, their casual chatter grating against nerves already stretched thin. But this stranger's quiet solidarity somehow made the burden lighter. A tour guide leading a group of American tourists noticed the scene and began explaining to her group about the discipline required of the Royal Guards. She mentioned how they couldn't move or speak while on duty, how they trained for months to achieve such perfect stillness. But she didn't understand what was really happening here. Children in the crowd grew restless, their parents pulling them along to see other sights. Business people checked their watches and hurried past. Street vendors called out their wares. London life continued its busy pace around the two veterans, but they remained anchored in their shared moment of understanding. Marcus's mind drifted to his last day in the Marines, when he had stood at attention one final time as his service medals were presented. The weight of transition, of leaving behind the brotherhood that had defined him for so long, pressed down on him now just as it had then. But here, in this foreign place, he had found an echo of that brotherhood in the most unexpected way. The sun climbed higher, and beads of sweat began to form on both men's foreheads. Neither moved to wipe them away. The Guard's wool uniform was designed for ceremony, not comfort, and the American civilian clothes offered no protection from the growing heat. Yet they both endured, bound by their mutual commitment to this unspoken ritual. A photographer from a local newspaper happened to be passing by and noticed the unusual scene. Something about the symmetry, the perfect parallel between these two figures, caught her professional eye. She raised her camera but then hesitated, sensing that this wasn't a moment to be captured casually. Instead, she watched, trying to understand what she was witnessing. James felt a drop of sweat roll down his spine beneath his heavy uniform. His feet ached in the ceremonial boots, and his arms had begun to tremble slightly from holding his rifle in position. But the American across from him seemed to understand these discomforts without being told. When James's breathing became shallow from the stress of maintaining position, he noticed the stranger's breathing slow and deepen. As if offering an example to follow, the connection between them was becoming visible to others now. An elderly veteran walking with his grandson stopped to observe, recognizing something familiar in the posture and bearing of both men. He whispered to the boy about military service, about the bonds formed between soldiers, about respect that transcended uniforms and nationalities. As the second hour approached, Marcus realized that something profound was happening. This wasn't just about honoring a fellow veteran anymore. It had become a meditation on service, on sacrifice, on the invisible threads that connect those who have worn their nation's uniform. The crowd around them was beginning to sense the gravity of the moment, even if they couldn't articulate what made it special. The Guard's commanding officer, watching from a distance, had noticed the situation developing. Protocol dictated that he should intervene if anything disrupted the ceremony, but his experienced eye told him that this disruption was actually enhancing the dignity of the moment rather than diminishing it. Neither Marcus nor James knew it yet, but their wordless encounter was about to touch hearts and change perspectives in ways that would extend far beyond this single morning in London. Word began to spread through the crowd about the extraordinary display of respect taking place at the guard post. Whispered conversations rippled outward as people pointed discreetly toward the American who had been standing motionless for 2 hours, matching the royal guard's unwavering position. The atmosphere shifted from casual tourism to something approaching reverence. Marcus could feel the attention gathering around him, but he pushed the awareness aside. This wasn't about performing for spectators. His focus remained locked on James, whose slight nod during a moment when the crowd's attention was elsewhere told him everything he needed to know. They were both committed to seeing this through. Whatever this had become, the physical challenge was intensifying. Marcus's legs had begun to shake with fatigue, and he could see similar tremors in the guard's hands as he gripped his rifle. The wool uniform that looked so impressive in photographs was becoming a furnace in the strengthening sunlight. Yet both men held their positions with the stubborn pride that had been drilled into them during their respective military training. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip gathered nearby, their teachers struggling to explain why this particular man was standing so still. One little girl raised her hand and asked if the man was a soldier too, even though he wasn't wearing a uniform. Her innocent question cut to the heart of something that many adults in the crowd were feeling but couldn't express. The royal guard's breathing had become more labored, visible in the slight rise and fall of his chest. Marcus recognized the signs of someone pushing through discomfort, someone refusing to yield to weakness. He had seen it in the faces of his Marine brothers during the hardest moments of their deployment, when giving up wasn't an option because others were counting on you to stay strong. James felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came with overwhelming emotion. Not sadness, but something deeper and more complex. This stranger had somehow understood what he needed without being asked. In a world where his military service often felt invisible or misunderstood, here was someone who saw him clearly and chose to stand with him. The photographer who had noticed them earlier had quietly taken a few respectful shots, but now she found herself putting her camera away entirely. Some moments were too sacred to capture, too personal to commodify. Instead, she stayed to witness what was unfolding, sensing that she was seeing something that would stay with her for years. A veteran from the Falklands conflict pushed through the crowd with his wife, drawn by something he couldn't quite explain. When he saw the scene, his eyes filled with tears that surprised him. He recognized the unspoken language being shared between these two men, the way military training created bonds that transcended time and distance and nationality. The crowd had grown larger now, but quieter. People spoke in hushed tones, as if they were in a cathedral rather than on a busy London street. Cell phones were put away without being asked. Children stopped fidgeting. Even the usual urban noise seemed to fade into the background. Marcus felt a cramp beginning to form in his calf muscle, the kind that would normally force him to shift position or stretch. But shifting wasn't an option now. He breathed through the pain, using techniques he had learned during survival training, focusing his mind elsewhere while his body endured. Across from him, he could see James doing something similar, working through his own physical challenges with quiet determination. The guard's commanding officer approached slowly, his face serious but not angry. He had been a soldier long enough to recognize something extraordinary when he saw it. Rather than ending the encounter, he took a position several feet away and began to observe with the same respectful attention that had infected the rest of the crowd. A tourist attempted to ask Marcus a question, but the older veteran beside him quietly discouraged the interruption. Understanding was spreading through the crowd without explanation, an intuitive recognition that they were witnessing something rare and meaningful. The usual tourist chatter had been replaced by an almost spiritual silence. James felt his vision blur slightly from the heat and exertion, but he blinked it clear and maintained his focus. The American across from him seemed to sense his struggle and responded with an almost imperceptible straightening of his own posture. A silent communication of solidarity and encouragement. The third hour was approaching, and what had begun as a simple gesture of respect was evolving into something that neither man had anticipated. They had become symbols of something larger than themselves, embodying the connection between all who serve and the price that service demands. The heat had become almost unbearable. Sweat poured down both men's faces, creating dark patches on their clothing and leaving salt stains on their skin. Marcus felt his shirt clinging to his back, while James's heavy wool uniform had become a furnace that trapped every degree of the rising temperature. Yet neither wavered in their commitment to this shared ordeal. A paramedic on her lunch break noticed the situation and approached with concern, recognizing the signs of heat exhaustion in both men. She spoke quietly to the commanding officer, expressing her worry about their physical condition. But when she looked at their faces, she saw the same determination she had witnessed in injured soldiers who refused evacuation until their mission was complete. The crowd had grown to nearly 200 people now, creating a natural amphitheater around the two veterans. Tour buses slowed as guides pointed out the unusual scene. Social media posts were beginning to appear, though most people seemed to understand instinctively that this wasn't a moment for casual sharing. Something sacred was happening here. Marcus's mind began to wander as his body struggled with the heat. He thought about the friends he had lost in Afghanistan, the ones who would never make it home to stand in peaceful places like this. He thought about the guilt that had haunted him since his return, the survivor's guilt that made every easy moment feel undeserved. But standing here, enduring this voluntary hardship, felt like a form of penance and honor combined. James was fighting his own mental battles. The anxiety that had been plaguing him for months seemed to crystallize into this single moment of trial. If he could survive this, if he could maintain his position despite the pain and heat and pressure, maybe he could prove to himself that he was still the soldier he used to be. The American's presence made it feel less like a solitary struggle and more like a shared mission. A news crew arrived, drawn by reports of the unusual standoff. But as the reporter prepared to approach for interviews, something in the atmosphere stopped her. The crowd's reverent silence, the intensity of concentration on both men's faces, the almost religious quality of the moment made her realize that intrusion would be a violation. She directed her cameraman to film from a respectful distance instead. The royal guard's legs began to shake visibly now, small tremors that he couldn't completely control. Marcus saw the struggle and felt his own body responding with involuntary tremors of exhaustion. They were both approaching their physical limits, but neither showed any sign of surrender. An old woman in the crowd began to cry quietly, though she couldn't explain why. Something about the devotion she was witnessing, the way these two men had found each other across cultural and national boundaries, touched a deep part of her heart. Her tears were noticed by others, and soon there were a few dry eyes among the spectators. The commanding officer found himself in an impossible position. Military protocol suggested he should end this before someone collapsed from heat exhaustion. But his soldier's heart recognized that intervening would rob both men of something important they were trying to accomplish. He decided to trust their judgment and their training, while keeping medical personnel close at hand. Marcus felt his knees beginning to buckle slightly, but he locked them in place through sheer force of will. The Marine Corps had taught him that the body could endure far more than the mind believed possible. Pain was temporary, but quitting lasted forever. These lessons, learned in the crucible of military training, served him now in this unexpected test. A child in the crowd asked her mother why the men were hurting themselves, and the mother struggled to find an answer that would make sense to a young mind. How could she explain concepts like honor, brotherhood, and the bonds forged in military service? How could she describe the healing that sometimes came through voluntary suffering shared with others who understood? The 4th hour was approaching, and what had begun as a gesture of respect had transformed into something approaching a spiritual experience. Both men had transcended their individual pain and fatigue to reach a place where endurance became a form of communication. Where suffering shared was suffering diminished, James felt his vision swimming again, but this time he didn't fight it. He allowed himself to enter an almost meditative state, focusing not on the pain but on the presence of his American counterpart. Together, they had created something beautiful from their mutual struggle, something that would resonate long after the physical ordeal ended. The crowd sensed that a climax was approaching, that this extraordinary display of human determination was reaching its crescendo. 4 hours had passed, and both men were approaching the edge of human endurance. Marcus swayed slightly on his feet, his vision blurring from dehydration and heat exhaustion. James's face had gone pale beneath his bearskin hat, and his rifle trembled in his grasp. Yet neither would be the first to break, neither would disappoint the other. By surrendering to their bodies' desperate pleas for relief, the crowd had become completely silent now, as if they were witnessing a sacred ritual rather than a street scene. Children sat quietly on their parents' shoulders, sensing the gravity of the moment even if they couldn't understand it. Adults found themselves holding their breath, afraid that any sound might shatter the profound connection they were observing. A military chaplain who had been passing by stopped and recognized immediately what he was seeing. He had counseled enough veterans to understand the spiritual dimension of what was unfolding. This wasn't just about physical endurance or military discipline. These two men were healing something deep within themselves through their shared ordeal. Finding redemption in mutual sacrifice, Marcus felt his legs beginning to give way entirely. His vision tunneled, and he knew that collapse was imminent. But as he started to waver, he caught James's eye one more time and saw his own desperation reflected there. In that moment of shared vulnerability, something shifted. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about recognizing that they had both already achieved something extraordinary. The paramedic stepped forward, her professional training overriding her respect for the moment. Both men were showing dangerous signs of heat exhaustion, and she couldn't stand by and watch them harm themselves. But before she could intervene, something remarkable happened that no one in the crowd would ever forget. James, still maintaining his rigid posture, managed the slightest nod toward Marcus. It was barely perceptible, just a tiny movement of acknowledgement and gratitude. But it was enough. Marcus, understanding the gesture for what it was, allowed himself to nod in return. Two tiny movements, almost invisible to casual observers, but charged with meaning for those who witnessed them. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, though no one could say exactly why. Something in those small gestures had communicated completion, had signaled that whatever these men had been trying to prove or achieve had been accomplished. The applause wasn't for entertainment or performance, but for human courage and connection in its purest form. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, though he wasn't sure when they had started. The emotional release was as intense as the physical exhaustion, as if 4 hours of suppressed feeling had finally found an outlet. He had come to London lost and searching, and somehow this stranger in a red uniform had helped him find something he didn't even know he was looking for. James felt his own eyes welling up behind his ceremonial composure. The anxiety that had been plaguing him, the sense of isolation and purposelessness that had made his service feel hollow, had been transformed into something meaningful through this shared experience. The American had seen him, truly seen him, in a way that made his struggles feel validated and his service feel valuable again. The commanding officer stepped forward, not to end the encounter but to honor it. His face showed deep respect as he approached James, and his bearing suggested that he understood the significance of what had just occurred. Military men recognize courage in all its forms, and what he had witnessed was a different kind of bravery than what was typically celebrated. The crowd began to press closer, not with the aggressive curiosity of tourists, but with the gentle reverence of people who had been privileged to witness something extraordinary. Many were wiping their own eyes, affected by the raw emotion and humanity they had seen displayed. An elderly veteran pushed through to reach Marcus, his own eyes bright with tears. Without words, he extended his hand in a gesture of brotherhood and recognition. Marcus, still swaying slightly from exhaustion, accepted the handshake with gratitude. Similar scenes began playing out throughout the crowd as other veterans identified themselves and offered their own quiet acknowledgments. The photographer who had been observing finally raised her camera, but only to capture the aftermath rather than the ordeal itself. The images she took would later become famous, not for their dramatic action but for their documentation of human dignity and mutual respect in its highest form. Medical personnel moved in to check on both men, but their concerns were met with weak smiles and reassurances. The physical ordeal was over, but something much more important had been accomplished. Two warriors from different armies had found each other across cultural divides and helped each other heal wounds that had nothing to do with enemy fire and everything to do with the cost of service. As the immediate intensity of the moment began to fade, both men found themselves surrounded by a crowd that had been fundamentally changed by what they had witnessed. The casual tourists who had arrived expecting a simple photo opportunity had become part of something much deeper, participants in a demonstration of human resilience and brotherhood that transcended national boundaries. Marcus accepted a bottle of water from a concerned bystander, his hands shaking as he tried to drink. The simple act of relaxing his military posture after 4 hours felt almost foreign to his body. But more importantly, he felt a lightness in his spirit that he hadn't experienced since leaving the Marines. The isolation and purposelessness that had driven him to seek therapy had been replaced by a sense of connection and meaning. James was officially relieved from his post by his commanding officer, who helped him to a nearby chair while maintaining the dignity of the ceremony. The relief showed immediately in his posture as the weight of performance was lifted from his shoulders. But like Marcus, his physical relief was overshadowed by an emotional transformation that would prove far more lasting. The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, as if leaving would somehow diminish what they had experienced. Many lingered, sharing quiet conversations about what they had witnessed, trying to put into words feelings that seemed to transcend language. Parents explained to their children that they had seen something special, something that showed the best qualities of human nature. A reporter who had arrived late attempted to interview Marcus, but he found himself unable to articulate what had just happened. The experience felt too personal, too sacred to reduce to sound bites or news copy. Instead, he suggested that the story wasn't about him or even about the Guard, but about the connections that exist between all who serve their countries with honor. The commanding officer approached Marcus with formal courtesy but genuine warmth. He introduced himself and expressed his gratitude for the respect that had been shown to his soldier and to the ceremony itself. What could have been seen as a disruption had instead elevated the dignity of the moment and reminded everyone present of the human cost and value of military service. James, still recovering in his chair, watched as Marcus was embraced by other veterans in the crowd who had identified themselves to him. The sight filled him with a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude for the stranger who had stood with him, sadness that their encounter was ending, and hope that the connection they had forged might somehow continue beyond this moment. An older woman approached James with her grandson, a boy of perhaps 8 years old who had been watching the entire encounter with wide eyes. She knelt beside the chair and quietly thanked him for his service, but more than that, she thanked him for showing her grandson what dedication and honor looked like in practice, rather than just in theory. The paramedic who had been monitoring the situation confirmed that both men were suffering from mild heat exhaustion but would recover fully with rest and hydration. Her medical assessment, however, couldn't measure the psychological healing that had taken place. Both Marcus and James felt stronger than they had in months, not despite their ordeal, but because of it. As James changed out of his ceremonial uniform, he found himself thinking about the conversation he would have with his counselor at their next session. For the first time in months, he had something positive to report. A breakthrough moment that had reminded him why his service mattered and why his struggles were worth overcoming. Marcus sat on a nearby bench, still processing what had occurred. A couple from Germany approached him hesitantly, explaining through broken English that they had been deeply moved by what they had witnessed. They wanted to thank him, though they weren't entirely sure what they were thanking him for. Their gratitude was echoed by others from around the world who had happened to be present for this extraordinary moment. The commanding officer later wrote in his report that the day's ceremony had been enhanced rather than disrupted by the presence of the American veteran. He recommended that the incident be remembered as an example of the international brotherhood that exists among military personnel, regardless of the uniforms they wear or the flags they serve. James and Marcus finally approached each other as civilians, their formal roles set aside. The handshake they shared was firm but brief, accompanied by mutual acknowledgement that words weren't necessary to express what they had shared. They had spoken volumes without ever opening their mouths. The crowd continued to watch as the two veterans exchanged contact information, both understanding that what they had experienced together had created a bond that shouldn't be casually abandoned. They had found in each other something that their respective struggles with post-service life had been lacking: understanding, recognition, and proof that their sacrifices had meaning. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same spot where their extraordinary encounter had taken place. But this time he wasn't alone. James had requested leave to meet him during Marcus's return visit to London, and together they had come back to the place where their lives had intersected so profoundly. The transformation in both men was evident to anyone who knew their stories. Marcus had returned to the United States with a renewed sense of purpose, using his experience to help other veterans struggling with post-service adjustment. He had started speaking at VA hospitals and veteran support groups, sharing not just his own story but the lesson he had learned about finding connection and meaning in unexpected places. James had experienced his own renaissance following their encounter. The anxiety and isolation that had plagued him had been replaced by a deeper understanding of his role and its importance. He had become a mentor to younger guards, helping them understand that their ceremonial duties carried real weight and meaning. His commanding officers had noticed the change in his demeanor and had recommended him for advanced training. Standing together at the guard post, they were approached by some of the same people who had witnessed their original standoff. The elderly woman with her grandson returned, the boy now old enough to better understand what he had seen. The German couple, who had been so moved by the experience, recognized them immediately and expressed their joy at seeing the two friends reunited. The photographer who had captured the aftermath of their encounter had used the images to create an exhibition about military service and sacrifice that had traveled to galleries around the world. She showed them the reviews and letters from viewers who had been touched by their story, people who had never served in the military but who had gained new appreciation for those who did. Their correspondence over the past 6 months had revealed how similar their struggles had been, despite the differences in their backgrounds and military experiences. Both had wrestled with questions of identity and purpose after leaving active combat roles. Both had felt disconnected from civilian society, uncertain about their place in a world that seemed to have moved on without them, but their wordless encounter had provided answers that hours of therapy and mountains of self-help books had failed to deliver. They had rediscovered their sense of brotherhood and purpose through mutual recognition and sacrifice. More importantly, they had learned that healing didn't have to be a solitary journey. James had brought along some of his fellow guards who had heard the story countless times and wanted to meet the American who had stood with their colleague. Marcus had arranged for several veteran friends to join him in London, creating an impromptu gathering of military personnel from both sides of the Atlantic. The commanding officer who had overseen their original encounter approached them with news that their story had been included in military leadership training programs as an example of how service members could support each other across national and cultural boundaries. Their spontaneous act of solidarity had become a teaching tool for fostering international military cooperation. As the day wore on, they found themselves surrounded by a new crowd, but this time it was different. These weren't casual tourists, but people who had come specifically because they had heard about the place where two veterans had found healing through shared endurance. Their story had become part of the location's history, a reminder that the most meaningful moments often occur not during official ceremonies but in the spaces between formal events. Marcus and James spent hours talking about their experiences since that transformative day, comparing notes on how their lives had changed and discussing their plans for the future. Both had discovered that their encounter had opened doors they hadn't known existed, opportunities to serve their communities in new ways while honoring their military backgrounds. As evening approached, They prepared to part ways again, but this time with the certainty that their friendship would continue. They had proven to themselves and to everyone who had witnessed their story that the bonds forged in military service could transcend individual experiences and create lasting connections that enriched both their lives and the lives of those around them. Though the guard post stood empty now in the gathering twilight, but the memory of what had happened there continued to inspire people from around the world. Two strangers had become brothers through shared sacrifice, proving that sometimes the most profound communications happen without words, and that healing can come from the most unexpected encounters. Their story had become a testament to the power of recognition, respect, and the unbreakable bonds that connect all who have served their nations with honor.